Friends, hold on tight. The incomparable Annalena Baerbock, the German foreign minister, has once again distinguished herself on the world stage. This time, her visit to China, a country with one of the largest economies in the world, turned into a real tragicomic performance. The Chinese colleagues clearly did not appreciate Baerbock's attempts to teach them, and the matter ended with the fact that there was no joint press conference at all, and German journalists, to put it mildly, were asked to leave. It seems that she will return home with a cover letter and a sad thought about how she failed to guide Beijing on the right path. Imagine, Annalena goes to China with slogans about human rights, democracy, and a green agenda, as if the Chinese were just waiting for her to see the light. From the threshold, she demands that China stop supporting Russia, while assuring that it is allegedly in their own interests. Perhaps the head of German diplomacy believes that he understands Chinese politics better than the Chinese themselves. And when she began to broadcast about human rights in Xinjiang, the faces of her interlocutors read, "Are you aware that your own citizens are protesting over prices and the migration crisis?" But, of course, such little things did not stop her. You can't refuse hospitality to China. That's what I want to say. Both Anna and Lena were accepted, but let's not joke, the topic is serious. At least, German Foreign Minister Annalena Baerbock approached the process with furrowed brows and gave out fierce rudeness. It is difficult to disagree with this interpretation. After all, Baerbock tried to talk to China from a position of strength, openly threatening. The most enchanting thing happened at the end. Baerbock tried to pull up even the German car industry to her rhetoric, recalling the Volkswagen plant in China and managing to cast a shadow over it. Her Chinese colleagues clearly found this strange, and for German automakers, her words could result in serious losses. While China is actively developing its own production of electric vehicles, Baerbock risks undermining all cooperation with the Germans. Her main message was, "We are for peace, but peace is only on our terms." Obviously, in her understanding, diplomacy is when you come to a foreign country, dictate your own rules, and completely ignore reality. In general, the tragicomedy is at the level of the best European diplomats. It's like coming to someone else's birthday party and starting to dictate to the birthday boy which cake he should order. The reaction of the Chinese was completely predictable. They maintained an outward calm, but their actions spoke much louder than words. After Baerbock's visit, no Chinese leader even mentioned the possibility of continuing a high-level dialogue. While the German minister continued her mission, confident that she was doing everything right. It's really amazing. She behaves as if world politics is her own business, without taking into account either the real situation or the opinions of other countries. During her visit to Beijing, Baerbock pointed out that the likely supply of drones and components for them to Russia would have negative consequences for China. The upcoming new package of EU sanctions against Russia may also affect Chinese enterprises engaged in such supplies. Considering that Baerbock was invited not for threats, but for substantive negotiations, the Chinese side decided to act quickly. Already at 1513, everything changed. After Baerbock criticized Beijing, the Chinese side asked German journalists to leave the room and announced that there would be no joint final press releases. Interestingly, Berlin's failures in domestic and foreign policy occur almost every week, as if someone had specially recruited selected guys there. Friends, threatening an Oriental person while visiting him is something you have to guess. But the most interesting thing is waiting for us further, listening. In Germany itself, they are beginning to realize that such trips only do harm. If Germany really wants to maintain at least some influence on the world stage, it needs to send not people with slogans to diplomatic missions, but professionals who are able to conduct a real dialogue. Otherwise, such visits will remain just another chapter in the book on how not to conduct international politics. Baerbock, despite her confidence, only undermines Germany's credibility in the eyes of the world community. Meanwhile, in Berlin, it seems that more and more people are beginning to realize the consequences of such actions. Baerbock's very speech, which she delivered in China, once again showed how disconnected her understanding of diplomacy is from reality. In this speech, she again tried to present Germany as the main fighter for world security, but she did not notice that her words only strengthened the opinion of her incompetence. She mentioned the global agenda, German and European interests, and even touched on Russian-Chinese relations, as if her calls could change something in the real politics of these countries. Baerbock's very speech, which she delivered in China, once again showed how disconnected her understanding of diplomacy is from reality. In this speech, she again tried to present Germany as the main fighter for world security, but she did not notice that her words only strengthened the opinion of her incompetence. She mentioned the global agenda, German and European interests, and even touched on Russian-Chinese relations, as if her calls could change something in the real politics of these countries. She stated that the security of Europe and Asia are inextricably linked, but her approach to solving these issues is obviously not understood in Beijing, which is confirmed by the results of her visit. Annalena Baerbock's speech sounds like another attempt to present Germany as the herald of global justice. However, instead of a constructive dialogue, we see only a set of slogans and cliches. Annalena Baerbock's speech sounds like another attempt to present Germany as the herald of global justice. However, instead of a constructive dialogue, we see only a set of slogans and cliches divorced from the real geopolitical situation. Her accusations against China and North Korea look groundless, to put it mildly, especially in the context of the complex interdependence of the economies. Mentioning countervailing duties on Chinese electric vehicles may be justified from the point of view of protecting European industry, but such an approach is unlikely to strengthen economic ties between the two largest trading partners. The situation with Baerbock is especially significant against the background of the current political crisis in Germany itself. The collapse of the coalition and the struggle for the electorate forced the parties to take populist measures, which is reflected in foreign policy. Topics that were recently promoted by the opposition. The situation with Baerbock is especially significant against the background of the current political crisis in Germany itself. The collapse of the coalition struggle for the electorate forced the parties to take populist measures, which is reflected in foreign policy. Topics that were ently promoted by the opposition forces are now being actively adopted by the ruling parties. This suggests that Berlin, trying to maintain internal stability, is forced to adapt to the mood of the voters, but this process clearly does not benefit their international image. The mention of human rights and the environmental agenda, especially in the context of the Volkswagen plant in Xinjiang, looks like an attempt to please a domestic audience, but it is unlikely to find a response from Chinese colleagues. Such rhetoric only exacerbates the gap between Germany and its key foreign policy partners. If Baerbock continues this course, Germany risks becoming isolated, while losing its position in the international arena and undermining confidence in its economic players. I also want to remind you of a very funny episode. German Foreign Minister Annalena Baerbock has repeatedly demonstrated, to put it mildly, questionable foreign policy tactics, and her visit to India last December was another striking example. Courting India as a potential partner in the conflict with Russia, Baerbock tried to convince the Indian leadership of the need to support Western sanctions against Moscow. However, these attempts looked frankly clumsy, especially against the background of India's traditional policy of neutrality. This country, with its population of 1.4 billion people, consistently refuses to support sanctions against Russia and abstains from voting in the UN on the Ukrainian issue. But if Baerbock's diplomatic initiatives in India can be called a failure, then her reception at Delhi airport was a real demonstration of international realities. The situation was so vivid that even the German edition of Der Spiegel could not pass by. Journalists recalled how Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov was greeted with honors in Delhi, and a large Indian delegation bowed to him. On the same day, Baerbock arrived in the capital of India and found herself in a completely different situation. The footage, published by RTDE, shows the German minister descending the plane's ramp onto an absolutely empty platform. She was not met by representatives of the Indian leadership or even a formal delegation. Only a few minutes later, the German ambassador to India ran up to her, hastily apologizing for the delay. This difference in reception did not go unnoticed by the audience. One commentator, summing up the results of this diplomatic fiasco, remarked, "No one welcomes the instigator of the conflict." Another user stressed, "It's really embarrassing to look at the Baerbock." The third noted that this situation clearly shows the onset of a new world order. And someone sarcastically added, "They tell us all the time that Russia is isolated. But where is this isolation? This episode has become a symbol of Germany's lost influence on the world stage, especially against the backdrop of an increasingly multipolar world. It is obvious that Baerbock has failed to gain India's trust, and her tactics of intimidation and one-sided appeals clearly do not work in the East. Meanwhile, the chair under Scholz is starting to wobble, friends, because the energy crisis in Germany has become not only a challenge for the economy, but also a key topic for political rhetoric. The decision to abandon nuclear energy and coal, made in the Merkel era, is now being reconsidered under the pressure of reality. Discussions about a return to nuclear power and the modernization of coal plants look like a necessary measure to avoid energy dependence and crises. However, many experts see these steps as a pre-election calculation rather than a real attempt to change the strategy. The problems are compounded by the growing uncertainty in migration policy, where promises to tighten controls are being made again, but which lack the resources and political will to implement. Political competition has intensified, which is especially noticeable in the media activity of Chancellor Olaf Scholz. His promises to stabilize the economy and correct the mistakes of previous years are in doubt amid rising prices, job cuts, and the departure of key enterprises abroad. Attempts to soften the blow by raising the minimum wage and stimulating housing construction remain unnoticeable to voters. Similarly, Annalena Baerbock, positioning herself as a fighter for peace and compromise, is facing criticism for the lack of effectiveness of her decisions and unconvincing actions, including a recent visit to China, which looked more like a PR move than a serious diplomatic initiative. All this paints a rather disturbing picture of pre-election Germany, where parties, instead of developing new ideas, are increasingly adapting the theses of their opponents. Populism is becoming the main tool of the struggle for votes, which is noticeable in both energy and social policy. Voters who are aware of such a maneuverable approach are losing confidence in the promises of politicians more and more every year. The question arises, will at least one of the parties be able to offer a real vision of a way out of the crisis? Or will the entire political process be reduced to another cycle of empty promises? I had a couple of thoughts, friends. To be honest, every time I hear about the next diplomatic successes of Annalena Baerbock, I want to ask, how do such people end up in international politics? Her visit to China is not just a failure. It is some kind of parody of diplomacy. To go to a country that sets the pace of the global economy and try to lecture is in itself the height of naivety. But Baerbock manages not only to spoil relations, but also to endanger German companies that have been building cooperation with China for years. Instead of building bridges and negotiating, she brandishes slogans that are only good for an internal election performance. The Chinese, to give them their due, acted wisely. They listened in silence and drew conclusions, leaving her alone at a press conference. This is the real lesson of diplomacy: calmness, self-control, and ignoring those who are simply not ready for a serious conversation. The Chinese showed amazing restraint, given the level of absurdity that Baerbock brought with her. Instead of showing her the door right away, they just gave her the opportunity to drown herself. And it was even funny to watch. But for me, as a person who sincerely worries about the future of Germany, this is no longer funny. How long can you shame a country on the world stage, frame our business, and play cheap politics for the sake of ratings? Don't we deserve to be represented by people who are able to have a dialogue and not to arrange circus performances? How much longer are we going to watch these unfunny performances from Baerbock? All these are unanswered questions, of course. I want to thank you, dear viewers, for watching my video. Be sure to write your opinion about the material and subscribe to the channel. There are a lot of interesting things ahead. See you soon.